Коллеги, я думаю, мы начинаем нашу сессию по...
Dear colleagues, we are going to start our session. So I would like to invite the panel members on stage. So I would like to say that today we are not going to have any presentations. We will rather just talk, and I hope that we are going to raise the issues, quite burning issues actually, because everything we are discussing in terms of developing environmental tourism, it is based on the infrastructure. And without infrastructure, it will be impossible to develop environmental tourism. I will introduce first everyone who participates in our today's session. Matvey Shparo, Russian polar traveler. You know him. He will be connected online. So he's here already. Natalia Danilina, president of the charity fund Заповедное посольство, representative of Russia in WWF. Marina Gritsun, Union of Organizers of Children's Tourism. Alexei Volkov, vice president and of the National Hospitality Industry Union. He will join us online as well. So hopefully he will be here with us. And we'll have an address of State Duma Deputy Natalia Kuvshinova. So let me start. So now we're launching the video address. A new federal law on tourism is going to be adopted soon. It's no secret that today's text of the law first of all regulates outbound tourism, but our task is to develop domestic tourism and inbound tourism, and of course we need to have adequate laws of good quality for that, and we are working on that in the State Duma. Development of tourism cannot be seen without environmental tourism. And this year, my colleagues and I made several initiatives on the amendments to the law 132, and it is all about environmental tourism. Today, Russia has lots of specially protected areas of the federal level and regional level, national parks and reserves, and they are getting more and more involved with the tourism industry. And on the one hand, we need to make comfortable, convenient conditions and safe conditions for the tourists and quality services. On the other hand, we need to provide for normal life and activities for those people who live in the grounds of the reserves or next to them. So indeed, when we speak about environmental tourism development, it is our priority, and I am sure that those steps that we've already made and other global steps towards the development of tourism in Russia will indeed allow to increase the tourist flow inside Russia and also increase the inbound tourism, making it more accessible, more interesting and more safe. So we are looking forward to your comments and questions and ideas, and we urge you to participate in our discussions. Thank you very much. Thank you. We will get back to this law today, this draft law that was mentioned. But generally speaking, if we speak about the legal regulations, and speaking about the environmental tourism, it's not only about the reserves, we mean all the national parks and other categories of those areas. So, in our country, recreational activities are not prohibited, and it's in the constitution. So you can do recreation, but the infrastructure, it is actually blocked. And office holders do not often understand very simple things. And they say that just it's not needed, it won't be in demand, and they don't really want to deal with all those issues, especially related to the infrastructure development. We have strategies for development of this and that, and it's important to have a strategy. Many regions are trying to develop something, but you need to have a systematic approach. And for the development of tourism, you also need a systematic approach. But strategies are being written without the unified terminology. Some people call hunting tourism. When these things when these things are adopted, then of course we'll have to pay attention to the terminology yet again. And children's tourism and the accidents in it should not lead to banning children's tourism. It happened many years ago in Great Britain, and they changed the approaches to organizing children's tourism, and the number of tourists increased and the safety level also increased. And in Russia, children's tourism is being destroyed, and Matvey will speak about that, and Marina as well. Also, we could mention the application of law, because very often we come across the situations when we have the law that allows us to do something good, but something weird is going on. For example, in Crimea, the Yalta Reserve, when it became a federal reserve, so it's become a federal reserve, not a national park. But this territory receives about 1 million tourists per year. And the Ministry of Natural Resources, accepting this status, assigning this status to this territory, made something weird, because a reserve cannot receive 1 million visitors, but a national park can. And when we have the reserves there, in such places, there will be social uproar, because people have been traveling there for many years, and you cannot force them to go and get a permit, but first file an application 2 days beforehand. So it will, of course, have an impact on the social situation. So it is not clear what to do. So there's a legal norm, but it's being used in a lame way. So especially with our supervising authorities. So it seems to me that the legal algorithm should be as follows. We agree about the terms right away, what we call children's tourism, sustainable tourism, environmental tourism, so the glossary should be very clear. After that, you make amendments to the federal laws so that they get harmonized on all the levels, because different bodies and authorities have different terminology related to the same things. So this should refer to everyone and everything involved and all the bodies and authorities, because we have supervising bodies that have their own regulating documents which allow them to collect money from people and block any activities, any projects in the natural territories, because this legislation is not detailed. So this is a great obstacle for developing environmental tourism and other types of tourism. So the question is, how should we build up this legislation? And we want the national projects related to tourism really developed. So we want the Ministry of Natural Resources really work, because we see the ecology national project receives no financing or almost no financing. And how can we break this wall between us and the Ministry of Natural Resources? So I have lots of questions, and personally I can say that, speaking about terminology, I would like to give the floor to Natalia Danilina and mention the draft law that was mentioned by Natalia Kuvshinova. And there, the definition of environmental tourism is the tourism related to visiting, preserving, studying the natural environmental systems and the species of flora and fauna inhabiting those reserves. So, yet again, the local population is left outside of this, but the international definition says that all those reserves must be beneficial for the local people. I did not really plan to participate in this section, but working in the previous section, I can say that I was a bit excited, and I made a post on Facebook, and I also got some comments even. There's yet another definition for environmental tourism that is being considered in the State Duma. So it is as follows. Environmental tourism includes visiting and studying of unique natural sites that includes cultural and historic heritage and wildlife. So this formulation can include everything that was said today in the presentations of the experts. So environmental tourism cannot be hunting and spa and picnicking and so on. So we had a lot of discussion, and let's not go too deep into detail, because we are doing the same thing, but we always come across it. So we don't understand the terms, the terminology, then this thing we are doing won't work. So environmental tourism, this definition was born in the middle of the 90s. And during this time, they constructed a real good bike that's rolling across the planet for more than 30 years, more or less successfully in different countries. And the formulation, the definition works. It was by Hector Lascarena. He's a Mexican scientist, and he was one of the first to formulate it. So Australia made this strategy in the end of the 90s, and then very successfully it was implemented. and down to many countries of the Central and Latin America and Africa. So this definition was made, and it works. It takes into account lots of details. And there are international definitions by the WWF and WTO and all those organizations. They base their definition on the 4 pillars that include everything.
So what is ecological tourism? So they state that this is visiting these sensitive natural territories and then impacting the biodiversity, but preserving it, and then of course educational aspect, and this is the support of the local communities. So when all these 4 pillars come together, and then we are able to understand what ecological tourism is. So we are not contradicting the local citizens that may become the victims of any type of tourism, including ecological tourism. We are not damaging the eco structures, and we bring forward educational programs. We educate people, and these are the important pieces of the puzzle without which we are not able to save the environment. And so lately we're kind of reinventing the wheel in some ways. We're constantly finding out some square-shaped or triangular-shaped or any type of other type of wheel instead of using what's happening in the world. Of course, we can adapt it to some way and harmonize it, but not to destroy the type of approach that was born in the world. And that's very important for today. And today, for especially protected natural territories, we use the term tourism, like kind of explorative tourism. And this, when we speak about exploration and learning, so learning tourism, so this is what is written in the law. And today we're stemming away from even this notion. And I think that it's important for all of us to tap into this experience and learn from the mistakes of other countries where they influenced, and we need to influence our legislative authorities so that they stipulate things rightfully. Because if we include every holiday maker lying on the beach an ecological tourist, then this would be, the crazy numbers. But we do understand that ecological tourism, in a true sense of this word, a very deep meaning, we want it to become the driver in maintaining and preserving and developing territories and building the structure for ecological appreciation of what we see and what we have in the world. And we want to be at the highest international level to show the capacities of our ecotourism for all these visitors and guests who come to our territories, including especially protected ones. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So, of course, it's very difficult to understand. I cannot get a grasp on why, for so many years, we've been discussing it for many years, the terminology, what is ecological tourism, what is not. But in the true sense, it's I don't understand either. So maybe we don't understand something. But sometimes, we run into some, let's say, misunderstanding from the bureaucrats and other officials on other tiers. I would like to give the floor to Matvei Shparo. So he is the polar explorer, but he is sitting comfortably, so he's not up in the North Pole, and so maybe he's going to share with us his view on the legislation. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. Then, getting prepared for this particular roundtable discussion, I've read a little bit about not about the law, but the law for tourism. And after the first reading, the State Duma of the Russian Federation, just as you mentioned, ecological tourism has become very narrow from the standpoint of, let's say, tourism at the specially restricted territories. Well, to view ecotourism, we should include all the open territories, not restricted, not special protected territories. I think that the specialist might also say that what is the percentage of the territory is specially protected or reserves, and but I think that most of the territory, these are just nice forests and open, vast areas of land with its own landscape, and they're very beautiful and unique places that do not, fit the category of ecological tourism or are not fit for the description, and law doesn't cover those. And so that was my first observation. Second thought is that it's a pity that at this forum, so we are kind of discussing these things within our community. So this is more of a boiling in a cup of water. So we, confess to each other, and we, moan and groan and share some breakthroughs. But the State Duma yet on another occasion invited us, but besides just this invitation, so there is no practical steps towards what in terms of the practical results of our activities. So when we have these initiatives, then we need to understand that we need to talk to people and who know their stuff, and the unique nature of, let's say, such conferences is that, of course, we need to be professionals in that, and all this knowledge has to be passed on to the legislation, because quite often we see that there are many professionals and we know what we're talking about, but when it gets into the law, so nobody takes, let's say, responsibility for that. And currently, we may say some words about ecological tourism, and then when we speak about instructors and guides, then we need to have another look at the legislation in this aspect about ecological tourism. So of course we can talk at length about it, what it is, and I do remember about a couple of years ago when Olga Golodets, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, there was a good offer, a good suggestion there actually. So all types of tourism should be reflected not in the law, not 132 law, but they should be reflected in some kind of guidelines, regulations, or rules issued by the government, because you cannot put everything into a law, and it's a must that, let's say, the decrees that are issued by the government, let's say, in children's tourism and active types of tourism, so are they part of ecological tourism or not? If we fit it into ecological tourism, then we might be missing quite a lot of important activities, and that's why I think that most probably it's reasonable to take a path that was introduced at the Council as not 132 federal law and the definition of what it is, but these rights to define should be put to the level of the government of the Russian Federation. So, but again, these are the ideas, and so at that I adjourn. Thank you. So thank you, Matvey. And Are you aware and have you read the material, studied the material on legislative acts, legislation of guides and translators, instructors, and so because quite a lot of work you've been working and involved in this sphere. So do you have any idea? So, well, of course, I do have something to say, because I've been working mostly with children and child tourism and instructors and guides and all these changes in the legislation. And unfortunately, there was this tragedy with some kids that suffered and lost their lives. Of course, probably there should be a special standard introduced, and probably the exams and tests. So it was the first reading, and so of course we need to read the law and make our comments about it. But how good this law is, and what is the reality of this law? So we need to look at the text of it after the first reading. And at one of the previous sessions, there was a talk on that, yes, there are some instructors and like shepherds, and there should be people who combine this function in the sphere of education, and so we should also keep in mind the whole aspect and should not forget. Of course, we need to look into the training of guides, and the system of education should be also pointed towards that. And all this lobbying is from the part of the companies that provide mountaineering, about the mountain guides and around Krasnaya Polyana and other things. But we should not forget that the instructors and guides, they are needed not only in Krasnaya Polyana, but during the, let's say, when you use some smaller fleets, some canoes and kayaks and baydarkas in Moscow region as well. So yes, and there were some tragedies at the Siam Lake. So unfortunately, this does happen, and so in Great Britain it was just like that. And I don't know. So how are we in terms of legislation, lagging, or we are fit? The trend, so are we reinventing the wheel? And why can't we take what's already existing and good industry and and children abroad, for example, can't we do that? So I think that you just cannot be satisfied with just one law. So probably some changes into this legislation, that legislation, and for example, the law about the guides, and this is just covering certain gaps that may not change, let's say, the whole story. And if we look at some countries, advanced countries, European countries, Japan even. So there are many other laws that underpin the tourism and for example, insurance, because the insurance is totally different in the West. If we compare it to Russia, liability and risk of health, it works differently. And of course, this law is done in such a way that also we need to look into that as well. And law number 2, a story that cannot be changed, is the let's say our public health law. So because the Article 31 that states that you can provide some medical assistance and first aid and help. So still going to remote locations, still, especially protected areas or not. So the instructor, yes, he can provide a CPR, but nothing else. So he may check the patient and call, and call the EMERCOM and call for the helicopter that might take days to arrive, and that'll be the end of it. And so it'll take some time, and many more conferences would be needed and required, since or until we see some of the changes, or actually before we see some of the changes in this sphere. Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. These are good points that you raised, and that's true. We speak about these things when we speak about, verifying and working towards mitigating and all this legislation, and we need to include insurance as well. And of course, these aspects should be interwoven and related. And we have online Alexei Volkov, Vice President of the National Union of Hospitality Industry. Alexei is our Executive Director. Alexei, you're here? Yes, great. So, Alexander, I'm happy to see you, to hear you, and I'm happy to see you. And so you see, yes, we are working in this sphere quite actively, and I'm here with, and we are at the crossroads where we need to, let's say, find where we are and to check our watches, as we say, and just to make sure that we're on the same page. And all these strategic documents that we've been discussing lately over the last 2 years, we need to bring them to the common denominator and align them with the goals, the national goals that we see stipulated in the National Priority Project. And these national projects are already in place, and we need to talk about the industry and work with the legislative officials and bodies, and of course outbound, inbound tourism. We need to include every type of tourism, and cruise line, for example. It should include railroad transportation and many other things. And what the Matvey was saying, speaking about interdisciplinary approach, I cannot agree more. And the amendments to the Constitution were changed. So you see, laws can be changed, and some new laws changed, and kind of push out some old legislation and National Priority Project, and we see a structure like a skeleton structure, and we see the code and the norms of the regulations, and it should be in harmony with some other legislative acts, and we don't even have the glossary of what these terms mean when we talk about such type of activities. So I don't understand why we are not having these things, and of course we need to talk about, speak the same language, and of course we need to use this terminology in a proper fashion. And in terms of the ecological tourism, where are we? So because the Agency for Strategic Initiatives presented Nature Life, and that's one of the important aspects of the program, and number of funds that receive the GDP of the country. So Evgenia or actually in the United States of America, Russia. So the GDP percentage, let's say the billions of dollars for the states on ecological tourism, and it's about 20% of tourism. And in Russia, it's a little over $10 million, and we're the biggest country. We're more than 2 million square kilometers of national parks, and at that, only 880 gorillas in Rwanda generate much more money. So this means that we, first of all, do not know how to count, gray money. We do not include the hotels, and we cannot calculate the number of tourists, and we cannot separate the flows of tourists and ecological tourists from others. And we need to, of course, understand and double down the number of people in the industry, and we need to triple this element, that element, and to ramp up and build everything more and bigger. And if we speak about the notions and the glossary, we need to figure out, in general, what do we want to achieve in ecological tourism? Where are we right now? What kind of elements hamper and prevent us from achieving those milestones, and what's stopping us from making and getting there? And let's say if we have an investor that approaches us, the national park or any special territory, of course they may face some of the challenges, and this challenge may not be the ministry or some officials, but it's true for all the participants. And the development of territories, if we see that it is the local utility companies, and of course, if we see that whoever builds roads, and they also need to be involved into some of the offering some service. But now you see those companies that build roads, they build just roads, and they don't have any, let's say, idea how to develop, let's say, rural areas, for example, or rural mortgage, business support, and we need to have all these things and tap into the experience of the best experience, not only outside Russia but also inside the country. And when we speak about the control and accountability, so we need to provide some more authority to the bodies of executive bodies in the regions, and have the separation of powers, and there should be additional functions provided to the private entrepreneurs, just as it happens outside Russia. And so the collection, not only the collection of data, but still, if we want to collect data, it can be done much cheaply and more efficiently. So, and if we speak about the development of ecological tourism and the strategic initiatives that have been provided, so we see the kind of projects, the kind of initiatives, and what our colleagues need to implement them. So first of all is the team, because you see the team, yes, they are important. We kind of miss this out, and then we need to understand that the tourism code is not going to help us per se. So we need to work cooperatively, and we need to have a special group under the aegis of Rostourism or any other organization, and then we're going to see what the regions are going to face, and we need to keep in mind the interests of these players and the ideas of promoting the regions, and then to think about the cashback or other tools of promotion. And by not having the proper infrastructure in the regions, we won't be able to develop these things further on. And this is going to be the infrastructure, and only after having that will we be able to build climbing and camping. So these are on the rise, but it's not for everyone, and it's not that everybody wants to be involved in that. And of course, then Priroda Life as a project, Nature Life, and I was a little late from an activity because a lot of people want to be involved in that, and they want to build a new infrastructure and have some new services. So I think that the initiative is there, the investors are there, and these are big teams, and we need to work cooperatively at the level of the state, and there should be intra-ministerial body that should not be only the Rostourism that doesn't have the capacity, but there should be a special office uniting other specialists, and of course we understand that we need to work cooperatively at multiple levels, and we need to create these projects and work on these projects where the organizers know how to build the business model and how to create an Excel file with the calculations, because in a true way, I mean, today is a good, favorable place, I mean, a time for, let's say, Russia. So in Krasna Polyana has never had so much demand, and we'll be able, instead of Courchevel and Sardinia, promote Russia.
So from my side, I'm ready to participate in the environmental tourism development as much as possible. Thank you. Thank you, Alexei. So your question was, what do we want from ecotourism? And I would like to rephrase Paul Eagles, who was here for several times in this conference, and he said a brilliant phrase: we want to love nature, not from a distance, but we want to love it really, touch it, walk there, breathe it. And without the infrastructure that can provide the access for the people, we won't be able to do so, because we heard a lot yesterday in the session where the representatives of the Ministry of Natural Resources were and the heads of national reserves. So it's our task is to preserve, but to show as well, maybe to the next generation. I do not want to wait for the next generation. I want to see it today, maybe next year. But I don't want to wait for our national parks, and I don't want them to receive not 10,000 visitors, but 1 million visitors. But that could be cool if at the same time they will be able to preserve the nature and support the local population, because today the situation is pretty tough. And when we speak about the strategies of the tourism development today, we always speak about mass tourism and non-mass tourism. I'm kind of afraid of this word. And I don't want to provoke anyone with it, because when we say something about mass tourism, and everyone usually responds that mass tourism cannot be developed in the natural sites. But what do you mean by mass tourism? For one territory, mass tourism is 10,000 people. For another one is 50 people, and 1 million people can be digested by another territory with no damages done. So this should be not individual tourism. This should not be a tourism for the top class of the society, but this should be popular tourism. And I would like to give the floor to Marina Gritsul. And I know that this year she was developing her own camping project, and I'm pretty sure she faced a lot during this season and the last season with various legal collisions, and she's done a lot regarding different drafts. Hello, dear colleagues. I'm happy to see everyone here in this room and online. As for the legal basis for the reserves, I own a business both for children and adults, and I'm also an expert working for changing the legislation. And as for our meeting on natural tourism and the draft law, so under the draft law that was introduced or is to introduce the amendments to Law 132, I'm afraid that if they do not take into account the comments that we sent there, we'll get a conflict between the interests of tourism development in the reserves. Because if you look at the terminology, now the environmental tourism is to be developed in the reserves, and if we do not involve private tourism, small and medium-sized business, we need to work with them. It's good that we have Rosa Hutor, but remote regions is the other model of business development. Now a few words about the problems of business development. Very often when I'm present in the discussions with the colleagues, especially with the superiors, and I think they have some rosy glasses, but we want to develop campings and glampings, but the business will be there, or an educational institution, or any organization or investor, they will stay there with those problems. And it is no secret that today the supervising authorities impose fines on any business in the reserves. So when you work in the reserve, you only work there with the director of the reserve. If the director is changed, all of your agreements will be dismantled. So that's the practice, and no fast money is available in Russia. And with glampings, 5 years is a very, very good forecast for payback. So we experience very strong pressure from the supervising authorities. Tourism in the reserves is regulated by the water laws. So water and forests. As soon as you start doing something, bringing children there, building a camping, organizing sanitary infrastructure, you cannot do it. It will take either a lot of time to get the approval, like 1 or 2 years, and any approval of any communications in the water protecting area, it will be several million rubles and about a year of work. So then water intake, water disposal, all of that. So the very simple sanitary infrastructure is impossible to construct. Modular houses, nice stands, and the constructors leave and you get the cars parked in the parking lot, and then you will have problems with the supervisory authorities. Then, of course, the Ministry of Natural Resources is in charge of environmental tourism. The Ministry of Agriculture that deals with hunting and fishing. Educational department as what refers to children. Children's tourism, and no one is in charge of it, really. And we see a lot of collisions in the laws. So my colleagues and I are trying to do our best to show the tools that we see to resolve those issues. So it is speeding up of approvals of capital, non-capital construction, and zoning of the territories, and passports of construction sites, and criteria of accessibility of facilities. So 11 or 12 laws are in this or that way regulating the tourism in the reserves, and especially protected areas. And we want to work with campings, with hiking, with adventure tourism. So that's a lot of work. We have many problems, and let's work with that. But I would like everyone, probably someone from Rostourism, or we should establish a project office. So we need someone to coordinate this work between the bodies, because we want all the authorities to sit down at the same table to discuss it, because you cannot bring all the problems to the governmental level. Probably you need to bring them the solutions. So that is it briefly. And as for the mechanisms, we've offered them, and Alexei has everything we came to from the standpoint of environmental tourism. Also, we would like to get it coordinated with education, and we would like Rostourism to help us, because it's about children's tourism, both educational and private. I know that you worked with a project of regulatory guillotine. So was it cancelled or abolished, as what refers to our proactive environmental tourism, or what happened? A few words about this situation. So it's not a remedy, and this mechanism supposed analyzing of the draft laws, and I'm an expert of the task force of the social task force. So there's a set of documents that need to be cancelled. They are mostly from the Soviet times. So whatever we accept or adopt now as laws, it was not in that mechanism. So we had sanitary norms and other norms and rules, and we were able to stop them, and we were discussing it with different authorities, but it was not thanks to our guidelines of work. If just similarly as this guillotine, we established some kind of center that will have analysts, experts, lawyers, and this work should be paid, of course, because they should analyze the existing laws, because all the norms of the federation entities and different bodies, well, as far as I know, no one could get a full understanding, complete understanding of what should be really excluded. So guillotine mechanism did not change anything. So a lot is hidden behind every doors, all the doors of the authorities. So in order to get an answer, you will have to wait for a month. So it takes us to write a letter with the lawyers for 3 to 5 days, and the answer will only be received in 30 days. But if you, from the legal standpoint, you formulate the question in the wrong way or mistakenly, they will just reject your letter. So maybe a task force should be established. Well, I'm already afraid of the word task force because we discussed it in Facebook. So if you want to bury any idea, then you get together with a task force and, well, it is very right that we really need to understand what and how is regulated, because in practice we see the supervisory bodies come to us saying that you should have bottled water here. That's a well-known story. So for washing socks, you should have bottled water, and you can make a trail here, but No navigation is allowed because it's a landscape reserve, and it's about changing the landscape. Yes, you can do the trail, you cannot do the navigation. As for the trails, it's not about signage or navigation. This can be resolved, but we have no legal mechanism that could allow to make the trail as a unique object. So we need servitudes because we want the trail to go through the reserve and the village and the private land. So I faced this situation myself when we wanted to get a servitude because we didn't want the fields with the trail to be developed by the construction companies. We speak very often about the trails, and there's an Appalachian Trail in the United States, and it is quite famous. It's been there for many years. Its length is about 3,000 kilometers along the Atlantic coast of the United States, and they started making it in the middle of the 20s. And the last land plot that was acquired by the management company that allowed it to be complete, and nothing will be constructed there. So the last land plot was bought in 2014. So for 90 years, it took 90 years for shaping this trail. So our children and the grandchildren will continue our work. But today we have the chance to push this thing forward. When a few years ago they asked me about what I'm doing, what are you dealing with? I was saying trails, and they were like, what, dead bodies? Yeah, because it's a pun in Russian. So many things are being buried with the task forces, but however, I still hope that we'll be able to do something, and probably will establish some kind of group to reconsider, task force to reconsider the legislation. So we want to understand who is in charge of what, and where we could face a trouble. And Dmitry Gorshkov, in one of our sessions, he mentioned legislation amendments, and he said that it is difficult to change any law, and this should not be done. And Mr. Bachin said that today's legislation does not allow us even to build a modern toilet. And if we preserve it in that way, then we'll get rid of the good things together with the bad things. So we really need to think about certain parameters of construction that is allowed, and then state expertise, governmental permits must be involved probably, but we have to have a basis. Do we have questions from the audience? Vladimir, I'm sure.
Yeah, so we've been talking at length about lifting barriers, and we're yet building barriers. So, for example, Matvey Shparo said a good thing. Maybe we don't need to have a federal law. And Alexei also said that let's introduce the notion of railroad tourism or cruisism. So, but the law is not written towards, changing norms of the research literature. Law regulates, and if there is this type of tourism, has something to, let's say, to manage. And in ecological tourism, yes, we do have some norms. And do we need 800 ways to describe, let's say, what this particular notion is, or maybe we are going to talk about some basic things. And Marina said, yes, we're not speaking about the norms and about the use of nature, about the transport and if we, or until we start looking at it as the notion regulated by different branches of industry, we would have to step into the territory of other branches of industry. It's hard not to agree with you, of course, and with your permission, I would like to comment. Tourism is just is a branch of industry, and so it's, if we want to look at some ways of regulations, then most probably we can do this regulation towards the two streams. I think it was in the United States of America. If we have, if we start from the land, from ground zero, so we can do it all year round. And of course, we verify and agree on many other things. Then it's quite possible to do, and then we can start from the subject. And when we speak about the children, of course, Matvey said correctly that qualification of the guides and instructors, it's the pure regulation of tourism within tourism. And if we put together classification, so if we want our children to travel, so and then to improve the growth and to lift the barriers, and for example, we would not lose money from, and entrepreneurs would not lose money. So I think that we are quite often afraid to solve and dig deeper into these things. Yes, I think that quite a lot of cautious observations about it, and people are cautious about it. And ecotourism, you may find it, let's say, this is like a nobody wants it. So what do we expect from ecotourism? We are expecting things to happen, but people who are responsible for these territories, do they need ecotourism or not? So because maybe they're happy with the things the way they are, and because quite often I think that this is the case. And we have two questions, and probably we can put them up on the screen. Okay, the second one. In order to feel and touch, so do we need to work on the culture? And maybe we should not go into the mass tourism, but maybe we should grow the framework, because of course the word mass tourism is going to be, would have a ripple effect. And again, second question is about the mass tourism at the special protected territories, and we need to invest into the upbringing of people. And so what can you say? So probably this is the process. Well, this is a two-way street, and there are some comments and people that are participating online. So I think that people have been listening to a lot of things, and quite a competent person from Kamchatka. So she wrote that she's heard a lot about these things about ecological tourism. So she thought quite deeply, and it's quite an interesting thing, and there are a lot of questions. And since we are discussing the law, and if there is the law passed, adopted, so of course there should be clear-cut and well understood notion of what it is, and because what goes into the law and what lives on, this should be implemented in reality, because if we have some particular laws, then if the law is not passed, then there could be some norms and regulations in Ministry of Justice, and this can be related to, say, awareness kind of tourism or strategy, how to develop this tourism at these protected territories. And We've been listening to some specialists great specialists from Sberbank who was really posing the right questions that our professional community was kind of asking dozen years ago, and we found solutions. So now it's business wants to find solutions to the questions, and we have already introduced these solutions, but nobody knows about it, and nobody in the bodies that regulate us, they don't know these things either. So we have good experience, and Natalia also mentioned that she gave us some examples that in Yellowstone 3% of the territory is used for tourism. I know, and I was there and I spoke to the director. He says here is, and that's it, and 4 million at least 3% of the territory, because they organize the tourism flows, they build the territory for proper use, they use it in a proper way. What kind of tourism can be allowed? Here we have motor cars, you don't get out, and that's controlled. Here it is on foot only, and only through the path. And so at 3% of the territory, they have huge development of tourism. That's one thing. And should we use this experience? Yes, and we're ready to do that as well. And another thing, so making money, not making money, so what kind of benefits do local people get? So these are the numbers that we find in the U.S. reports, the relationship or a ratio of investments into these programs. And so I calculated in dollars, $20 million. So this is what we have in the federal system. In the United States, $3 billion, more or less. Now it's a little bit more, depending on the year. And do you see the difference? And yes, we say, of course, they make huge amounts of money. Of course, they have crazy money. And people who live nearby, they make a lot of money. So they count the efficiency and efficiency of tourism in the national parks. And they calculate not what the national park makes, but what is made at the 60 mile around the national park. And if we calculate what is generated around the national parks, then this means that the parks from the budget received $3 billion and brought into the territories $12 billion. Is it profitable? Yes, it's but it's not the park per se, because the parks get the funds no more than 20% to their budget, on top of their budget, on top of what they make, and they don't have this task to make, let's say, a huge amount of money. But the most input benefit is for the area, because the area gets developed where tourists stay, where they eat, where they let's say park their cars and use the laundry services. And here we also heard from our museums, so they want to make a little bit of money simply because their budget finances only very little. So when, of course, you have, of course, only 20 million, of course you want to make a little bit more money. Of course, I agree. And on the one hand, we need these rules and regulations, and of course, these people that should be involved that have not been involved in the system. So we should bring in new people, but also we need to bring in hardcore professionals of the industry as well, so that they would this would be a perfect match of those people who solve problems, increase the awareness of the public, and things are beneficial, financially beneficial to the local communities. And we had a comment from the photo correspondent and who loves ecotourism, and he posts that the more he listens to us, the more he cares, and the more he worries about these territories. And what I want to do is I promote territories since 1997, and the deeper we, let's say, go into the woods, of course, I share his, let's say, voice of concern. Before we make this final decision, we need to understand what we're talking about, because we have some loopholes in the legislation, and not having the proper legislation, we're creating more, let's say, not allies, but the people who are not supporters of this industry. And these people, of course, they want to preserve nature and they're eco-friendly, but they're not on our side, and they start worrying. And I really sense all these things myself. I do want, throughout this discussion that we have, of course, usually Rosa Hutor issues recommendations, and they have some ways to promote these resolutions, and probably this, of course, the Shparo also said that we're kind of stewing in our own juices, and well, of course, we hear each other very well, but we need to make our voices heard, and we need to get to the decision makers. And much depends on what is happening in the higher ranks of power. And without this experience that we've gained, and huge experience, Russian experience, plus the world experience, I think we won't be able to really deliver, and most probably we will not be able to say, of course we don't want to fight, we want to assist, so let's be on one side. So of course, so we need to discipline people behave in the right way. So in the West, and our people are like barbarians, so we need to stipulate the notion of building the mindset of eco-friendly mindset, and given the rules and regulations, we need to set the guidelines and how to behave. And as it was in Moscow 15 years ago, so again, the speed, let's say, but in Moscow it's only within the speed limit, because huge numbers of cameras, and you see same people in Moscow, but they drive slower because of the cameras and speeding tickets, I guess. So, and probably it's not the people who travel to Altai, Baikal, and it's not the number of people, because I think not so many people travel to Baikal in order to die of and being and feeling the pressure, anthropological pressure. Simply Baikal is not fit to receive these people, because quite often the promotion of a region or destination such as Baikal, and here we also have Leviathan, and people went in droves, and the hotels appeared in those areas where popular films were shot, so it works well for the development of internal tourism. But those people who know this territory, they say that the hordes of people, trapped on everything, and so there was the radius was, let's say, was damaged simply because there were no paths, no toilets, and the problem is not so much in the number of people, but the infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, and their behavior depends on this infrastructure. So we don't need to be afraid of the word mass tourism. We need to speak about the infrastructure that would receive as many people as we want. So 3% of Yellowstone, the national park, that receives 4 million people a year, and that's not the top, let's say, visited site. I think Smoky Mountains, 13 million, 13, and it's still not been damaged and destroyed completely, and people, there are still people. So I think that the working with children, and I think that it should be done in a proper way. So, question there? my comment is going to be that people are the same. Maybe in America are the same, but Europe a little bit different. And American colleagues say that people are people. So what do you expect? But if people know that we have a ranger here, if they are aware, and that if they're trained in Yellowstone, they even have the jail. And the people know about the jail in Yellowstone, then the rule of law prevails, and people, when they see others, when they see the work is done and everything is done in a great way, so they treat it nicely, and when they see how trash is collected, they get used to that. If, let's say, if they see a dump site, of course they will throw more garbage into that dump. And of course, organizing the territory, building it in the right way, so that's important. And of course, the people who own the territory, they have to take the lead there. So that's good examples, yes. And I think that Victoria also said that so we should be responsible for violating these things. And Yellowstone jail, yes, probably we should also have this as well. Maybe we should build jails and have fines, and so it can be not be a jail, but a kind of hard labor, and you just build paths and trails, something like that. So this is just the hard work. No, this is the practice of Yellowstone. So we're tapping into the best examples from the West, not tapping into the examples from Stalin's times. No. So, yeah, I think that people are kind of supporting my concept, but you see, the being reprimanded in public, it's also a good thing. And so quite an example that I lived in Sevastopol a couple of days ago. So there was the smart bus stop with internet, Wi-Fi, everything. It was glowing, but one let's say week later, some drunken guys, they just tore all these things out, and there was graffiti, but they didn't know that there was a camera there, and they were not fined, but they worked let's say one month of work in the center, and that was in public, and this was once and only. That's a huge thing when you didn't find them, but they worked. And they were, let's say, punished not by money, but some labor, and you publish information about it, and everybody knows about it, and people understand that it doesn't work. But Yellowstone, still, I'm sensitive to such things. About the fines and cooperation with business, I would like to say, my note, observation. So we introduced one thing. So let's say if any business wants to enter, any organizer goes to this territory, so they don't know what they're going to see there. So they don't understand what kind of risks you want to build a camp, you want to build a parking space, or you of course you see what you can build there, but in the roster, so of course we need to supply information about the war, what to supply, and we have a lot of bodies that should not submit any information for Russian register, Grand Register, and if they do, they comply with some old norms and regulations. If we improve the transparency about the land plot, the trail, where you want to go on an excursion. So this is through digitalization in terms of the land plots and collecting information that may be limiting at times, and where there is overseeing of some of the aspects. It can be forest, it can be water, it can be paperwork, and based on the, let's say, Rostourism and one-stop shop or one window service for documents. So you can apply into just these structures, and this is going to improve. And of course, there will be fewer fines, and you will have better control for the overseeing, and investors are going to be happy about it as well. So this cadastre and land plot, of course, important to look into the transparency, because without this, the data investor is not going to invest, and that's a totally different block of, topics and questions. So, colleagues, I think that if there are no questions from this room and on the internet, so I think that the topic, of course, is huge, and we need to get back to this topic on a regular basis and collect more information. And I would like just to add that I came across such a document that in the Soviet Union, when they created the system of routes and paths in more than 100 ones at the federal level, and smaller ones, thousands smaller ones, 2 research institutes were involved. 2 research institutes tried to find out how the Soviet legislation, which was much easier and was more authoritarian in its control. So you see, 2 research institutes reintegrated these things about the infrastructure and the anthropogenic load. And so you see these the 2 research centers, and this is the kind of intellectual force that was used, and they were figuring out what needs to be done. And Americans themselves, in the middle of the 50s, they came across the same problems when they increased the mobility, they built highways, and people started to travel. So the system of national parks was relaunched in the United States within in the mid 60s, 50s and 60s, and people, of course, had a wave of complaints, and they said, why do we need national parks? Because we're not satisfied with these national parks. They live by their own, and we don't get any service from them. We cannot enjoy these things, and there's no convenience of using those spots. And in the mid-50s, there was a committee in Congress. For 10 years, they've been analyzing the situation, and they relaunched the national parks, and the idea with paths and the National Trail System Act, so the national parks turned, let's say, their faces to people. So in Russia we also have some good roads. We have more and more roads. We travel more, and now this COVID thing, we want to travel, but here we have some limitations. We can't fly, but you see that there is demand in society, and I think that's the right time for us and for the state officials to get together and pull themselves together, and not to set up task force, but there should be like a center that should 24/7 devote their attention to that. That I would adjourn. Thank you very much.
Хорошего вам вечера на Красной Поляне.